Tom Walsh here from Annapurna Executive today, and speak with Louis Fernandes about a topic that is on the mind of every Chief Revenue Officer and indeed most executives right now, and that is productivity. But specifically, I think a way of thinking about productivity through the way in which we equip, train and coach our teams that I know you feel really strongly about, Lou. So maybe before we go into full detail, good opportunity for you to both introduce yourself and also maybe give a bit of context as to how Chief Revenue Officers are actually thinking, when they are thinking about productivity today.
Well, firstly, Tom, thanks very much for having me here. Delighted to be here. I think, as you rightly say, the thing that's vexing most revenue executives today is productivity. As we've come to the end of the era of what I term free money, people have suddenly remembered that it's not only about revenue growth, but it's about profitable revenue growth. So one of the things that we increasingly need to focus on is how quickly can we get those sales cycles up and running? How quickly can we make our reps productive? And how quickly can we get deals closed? And I think the main thing that people have focused on is how do you do this in a scalable, repeatable, predictable way? And I think that's been a real challenge for a lot of people. The way I think to do that is that you need to get consistency across the team in how they perform. And I think that certainly from my perspective, the way you do that is, as you rightly say, is you need to equip the team, train them in a consistent way, and then coach them back to that training so that it's reinforcing the behaviours and that they can then work within the sort of guardrails you supply as a leader to be able to be great. And I think that's one of the challenges that there really is out there at the moment. When I talk about equipping, training and coaching, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get that consistency of behaviour, that consistency of performance, so that our frontline individual contributors, whether they're reps, sales reps, whether they're account managers, customer success managers, whoever in our revenue organisation, to really know how to approach a particular situation, to really know how to get through the sales process. You may remember a few years ago there was the Challenger sale that came out by Matt Dixon, and one of the things he talked about there was the number of people that are now involved in the sales process, and it's particularly true in enterprise deals. And I think we have to make a little bit of distinction here, because we're going to talk predominantly about enterprise deals, but a lot of this stuff also applies equally in the mid-market and also in SMB, just maybe not the complexity, but we need to think about that. And the whole point was, he was talking about that the number of decision makers that were involved in a process was upwards of 5.6, I think the number was. A few years later, we then had the Challenger customer come out. That number had gone up to 7.6 or 8 or something like that. And I think now that we've had the sort of economic crisis post-COVID paradigm, that's only become more complex. Because again, money has dried up. People are reluctant to make decisions. There is now, in Dixon's latest book called The Jolt Principle, he talks about the fear of commission and the fear of omission. People fearing making a decision that they're then going to regret, and people wanting to make a decision because they don't want to miss out. So almost the FOMO piece. And caught in the middle there is indecision. So it's how do we equip, train and coach our teams to overcome those indecisions within a framework that is, like I say, repeatable and scalable.
And so if we begin with, I suppose, that idea of equipping somebody, setting them up for success, whether that's somebody coming in as a brand new employee, maybe coming into a new organisation yourself and actually establishing a new way of working, what do you see as the priorities from day one when that individual's kicking off?
So one of the things that we've seen over the last decade is that tenures have gone down generally, whether that's for individual contributors, whether it's for frontline managers, whether it's for VPs of sales, whatever, the tenures have gone down. Consequently, the retained knowledge within the organisation has also diminished, because people aren't around for so long, so you need to get them up to speed quickly, and they need to be able to find things. Now, one of the things that I think is very prevalent in a lot of organisations is the amount of content that gets produced is almost exponentially larger. You have hundreds of pieces of content for every single combination and permutation of a proposition, depending on the segment that you're targeting, the vertical, all sorts of things, the individual personas. So the first thing is to equip that team. How are you going to help them connect with that content? The majority of content that gets produced in an organisation, and I think the stat is something like about 90% of it, never gets used. And we see it all the time. So you've got your product marketing teams, you've got your marketing teams producing all this content that nobody ever uses. So the first thing is, how do you catalogue that and make it readily available to those teams so that when they want to know something, they can find it? Think of it almost like central intelligence for the organisation, and a catalogue of stuff that you can almost search in the same way that you would do using something like Google. But they need to be able to find it, they need to be able to find it quickly. One of the other things that's very, very prevalent is the amount of time that frontline reps spend pulling together content for presentations and so on and so forth is just mind-boggling. And that's all time they're not then spending in front of customers. So the best thing we can do to equip them is make that really easy, to find the right information, to find the right data, to make their lives easier so they can learn about their craft, they can understand how to position the propositions, and they can actually put that in front of customers very, very easily in a consistent manner. So that's part of the equipment piece. The other part of the equipment piece is, what do I do when somebody, as you rightly say, initially comes on board? And one of the things that a lot of revenue leaders will look at, they'll say, right, okay, I've got a new rep coming on board, somebody new, I have a ramp period. Typically in most software organizations, that'll be a 6-month ramp. And that's fine and great and fantastic. But once they come in, after that initial onboarding, what are you actually doing to ensure that they continually learn so they get to the point of being not only effective, that's the first trick, making them effective with your proposition, but then make them efficient. And when we talk about ramp, the way I think of it, and certainly from my experience, after about 6 months, you've finally got your frontline reps to be effective, not necessarily efficient. Efficiency can take up to 2 years. And that's, a real challenge for revenue organizations. So how do I accelerate that? So again, part of what I might do is I might turn around and say, yes, we have our initial onboarding. Might be 1 day, might be 2 days. And in some larger organizations, there may even be a 1-week boot camp. But then what? The stats show again quite clearly that I think it's actually up to 95% of all the training that people get, within 3 months they've forgotten about it if it's not been reinforced. And it's that whole, so you've equipped them and you've trained them initially, but then you do nothing and they fall back into bad habits. Now that could be bad habits around the sales processes you have. It could be bad habits around how you position the proposition. It could be bad habits around the way that they just do their discoveries. Whatever it happens to be, unless that's being reinforced at an organizational level, bad habits will start to form.
Yeah, because there's a lot in that 95% that could be.
It could be. Now, clearly, some people that we're bringing into the organisation, they will have been through the process before. They will have their own ways of doing things. They will know instinctively what to do. But then you end up with inconsistency because person A might have learnt it at large co, for want of a better term, and they have a particularly set process and they've done it like this. Person B might have come from, a very tactical, nitty-gritty, down and dirty scale-up, and where you're more entrepreneurial, and they've got a very different way of doing things. That means you then have inconsistency in the team. And whilst you want to give people the latitude to be creative, you also need to create the guardrails within which they can operate so that you get that consistent sales motion. And I think that's kind of important. So it's how do you reinforce that? Now, the thing that I would say here is that that's not necessarily down to the CROs, but actually a lot of this is incumbent then on the frontline managers. And I think they are probably the most forgotten cohort in any organisation, because the focus is then very much on what are my reps doing, but not how am I equipping, training and coaching my frontline managers, who are the ones ultimately that are going to be responsible for ensuring that the teams that are on the ground, boots on the street, are performing. And if they haven't got a consistent way of equipping, training and coaching their teams so that they know what to say, they know what to do, they know what to show, then it's going to be a problem.
So this isn't just a matter for account executive, this is right the way through.
Absolutely. I think it's almost a philosophy or a belief that this is how you go about getting consistency. I mean, we see it all the time where, you know, if I'm a new frontline manager, and this is, I think, quite typical in a lot of organisations where you have fantastic individual contributors who then get promoted into their first frontline management role. And it's literally, right, congratulations, well done. You're now on your own, off you go. And nobody bothers to equip, train and coach them on how to lead, how to manage. And what invariably happens in those instances is you end up with a manager that will turn around and say, right, so what did I used to do when I was this fantastic individual contributor? I did X, I did Y, I did Z. Therefore, what I need to do is I need to make sure my team do X and Y and Z. But nobody's taught me how to coach. So the way that I help them do X and Y and Z is I actually go into their meetings with them, and then I save the day when I can see things going slightly off-piste by intervening myself and bringing it back on course and doing X and Y and Z for them. Hooray, I've saved the day. We get the sale. But the challenge is, if you have a team of 6 reps, how are you going to be at every single meeting? You're not. If I have a team of 6 reps and I'm the one coming into your meetings and saving the day in inverted commas, what are they learning? And then you end up with a problem of scale, because that's just not a scalable behaviour. Whereas actually, if I allow my reps, when they're first coming on board, to make mistakes, and then we deconstruct that afterwards together in a coaching session, then you're more likely to take that on board as an individual contributor and learn from it. And because you then own part of the solution, because you've contributed to the solution, it stays embedded.
And just before we go maybe further into that coaching question, I know you've talked previously about the impacts they're having actually a much more disparate workforce, you know, over in the past 2, 3, you know, if not longer now. What impact have you seen there being of not being able to have those, you know, water cooler, bump into the corridor conversations, and how you actually do that if you're not physically next to or learning through osmosis?
That's a great question. And I certainly remember, you know, back in the day when I first entered the workforce, you know, it was literally sitting next to somebody and watching what they did, and then them letting you do it, and them sort of catching some of the mistakes you were making, but then also talking through it. And you did learn through a process of osmosis. Today, again, like you say, I think because of that whole hybrid / remote first, which a lot of software companies have gone down the route of doing, it's, I think, very difficult, certainly for some of the younger employees that are coming in. You know, if it's my first job out of university and I move into, say, a BDR role, and I'm remote, how on earth am I going to learn anything? Because I don't know what I'm doing. It's literally, here's your laptop, off you go, knock yourself out, in the same way that we just talked about the problem with the frontline managers. So it's incumbent on us to maybe then look at how we do that through using some of the technologies that are maybe available to us. So the things that I think about is I look at 3 different types of technologies. You've got sales enablement technologies, and there are a plethora of them out there at the moment. I mean, the 2 sort of top ones that sort of come to mind are people like HighSpot and seismic. They do a very good job of those kind of things. And then you've also got conversational intelligence platforms. And that'll be things, one that most people are familiar with, a Gong, but there are Aurum, other sort of softwares that are out there, and that's also really useful. And the way you use those things, because a lot of these things have got generative AI now built into them, and certainly the ones that aren't generative yet, they've just got the normal AI models that are there. And they're looking for keywords. So where is that consistency of how we interact? How are we interacting with our customer in terms of what's the percentage of talking that I'm doing versus you, maybe? What's the quality of the questions that we're asking? And you can use tools like that to sort of say, as a manager, even if I can't be present at all of those meetings so that I can observe, I can certainly look at where those consistent bits of behaviour are, where those inconsistent bits of behaviour are, how people are using the assets that we have, and when they are using them in the sales process. And then we can talk about it in a sort of debrief, when we're doing our one-to-ones. And I think that's another important thing, because I think the way that managers use their one-to-ones with their AEs, their account managers and their CSMs is generally, it ends up being a bit of a pipeline review. So where's your pipeline? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. Rather than actually, what is it you want to talk about on the one-to-one? How am I going to help you be a better version of yourself?
And this is where the question of what your intent is going into those meetings. So you've got the accountability element. Technology's enabled you to be in that position, even if you haven't seen that rep physically for 2 weeks, 3 months.
Totally.
But then there's still the question of what is your intent with the information of that technology.
Absolutely. And I think this is the other thing, when we talk about intent. If every interaction I have with you turns into, tell me about your pipeline. What's happening with this deal? What's the next step? How are we getting on with this deal? It becomes an interrogation, and that's no fun for anybody. And consequently, you're sitting there going, blimey, well, how am I reacting to this? What am I learning from this? And you're on the back foot. If instead of that interrogation, we have a conversation where my intent is to say, how can I help you? Tell me about a situation you've had this week where you've maybe felt that things haven't gone quite right. How can we help overcome that? And we'll talk it through. And again, rather than going into the thing saying, right, well, actually, you've told me that. This is what you did wrong. You did X wrong, you did Y wrong, you did Z wrong. It's like, okay, you're sitting back and you're sitting there going, oh, blimey, all right, I've got to do things differently. But again, that's not necessarily teaching or coaching. It's like almost berating. Whereas if we have a conversation and say, that's really interesting. So how do you think you might have done that differently? Or what do you think you could have done differently? Or are there any other things you may have wanted to say at that point? And then you're thinking about things, and you almost, through guided questioning, you get to the answer yourself. You then own that answer. And because you've come up with a solution yourself, it becomes more entrenched in how you will behave next time. And that's infinitely more powerful. And again, that's the equip, train, coach piece. And again, goes back to this idea of a lot of people don't get taught how to coach. So that's where a lot of the challenge lies.
In a similar way, I suppose, that you would hope that those, reps, account executives, the way in which they're actually dealing with their customers is finding a solution for their problem together. They're not saying, do this, buy that, that's how it's done. They're taking them on that journey, as a pair to achieve the problems they've got internally.
Yeah. Exactly. The antithesis of that would be almost like the Harry Enfield caricature of you don't want to do it like that, you want to do it like this. And it's not that. And it's trying to avoid that at all costs. And again, the whole point of coaching is with coaching comes accountability. So if we agree that this is how we're going to try and improve things for your benefit, because we've both agreed this might be a better way of doing things, how am I now going to hold you accountable for doing that? And what are we going to agree as the milestones to ensure that that behaviour becomes the new norm?
And then once you have that, I suppose, infrastructure in place, once everybody knows, how that's going to run, what the most effective way of doing so is, and what technologies you use, where do you then deploy that? Because I believe you've got quite specific ideas about actually strategically for the business. Once you've got the, as you say, the guardrails in place, how do you then actually go out and focus that?
Yeah, if I can take one step back from that, first of all, because again, we need to define what best practice looks like. And again, best practice will vary from organisation to organisation. And it will also vary, I think, from, the segment or persona that you're serving in any given circumstance. And what a lot of organisations don't do is they don't map what that best practice looks like for their organisation. And what you can do beforehand is using things like conversational intelligence. You can say, actually, these are my best performing reps. What is it they're doing differently? How are they getting better pipeline? How are they getting close rates that are higher than everybody else? How is their deal velocity faster than everybody else's? What is it they're doing? How are they positioning our proposition? Once you've got that, that's how you then need to build the sales motions and the playbooks so that everybody then has something that they can work towards. Because I think if you haven't got that in place first, you're creating a process potentially that may be wrong. So that's a really important building block, first of all. So look at the best reps that you've got, first of all, because the top sort of 10, 15, 20%, they will instinctively do what they know to be right and they will be successful. This then goes back to how you deploy it. Because once you've got that, you don't need to deploy it necessarily with the vigor you might do for other segments to that top 10, 15, 20%, because they're already doing the things they need to do and they do it instinctively. Now, I think what a lot of managers will say is, look, my problem children, for want of a better term, are my lowest performers. I need to focus my attention there. I don't believe that's the right way to deploy it, because you have this huge section in the middle, the forgotten middle, that don't get the attention. And actually, by making a few tweaks there, you could increase their performance exponentially. I think it was Gartner last year, they had a look at individual contributor performance across the board. Every single software segment, organizations, large and small, startups, well-established, whatever. And they found that individual contributors, on average, hit 38% of their quotas. Now, if you think about that, that's abysmal. And if that's the average, it makes you think, well, where's the bottom and where's the top?
Yeah.
Right? And you sit there and you go, what then are the costs that I'm incurring? Again, we've lost free money. That doesn't exist anymore. We've all suddenly remembered that the old adage of it's revenue for vanity, profit for sanity. So we're all looking to be profitable and we're looking at EBIT. So if we're doing that, do we really want to be spending the kind of money that we're spending on an individual contributor who actually isn't contributing anything or marginally anything? Or are we better off investing our time and effort on somebody who's bang on in the middle and they've hit that 38% and we can increase their performance? And again, not my opinion, the data shows, and this was data I think that actually HighSpot released, on average, where sales enablement and revenue enablement practices are well implemented in organizations, they see on average a 19% increase in performance. So if I say the top 20%, they're okay, the bottom 20%, okay, that means that there's an entire, 60% in the middle, that if I could increase their performance from that 38 by 19%, the last time I looked, 38 plus 19, 57, which CRO is not going to want an improvement of 38% of quota attainment to 57% of quota attainment across the board? That's huge. And if you think about that from a productivity point of view, which is how we started this conversation, if I can do that, the impact on productivity, the impact on revenue, the impact on CAC to LTV even, these are key metrics that every executive is looking at. That's huge. And I think most CROs would agree that solves their productivity problems at a slice. So I think it's important to look at it in those kind of terms and really focus the efforts on that forgotten middle. And again, this is where I think we need to equip, train and coach our frontline managers so that they know where to focus their attentions to get the biggest bang for buck ROI, however you want to describe it. And it's not even return on investment, it's return on effort. The effort they put into the equipping, training and coaching.
And setting up, through empowering their teams, actually setting them up for not just success over the next quarter, next half, but in the longer term.
And I think that's a great point, actually, Tom, because, so often a lot of revenue leaders are, quarterly driven because of the numbers. This is my quota, I'm going to miss my number, therefore I have to double down on these things and focus on the number in the very short term. That they're sacrificing the next quarter and the quarter after just to make this quarter. They're better off trying to fix the actual underlying issues. And yes, it may take a quarter to do that, but actually the investment now will save the day 2 quarters out, 3 quarters out, 4 quarters out. And that's where you're making those investments. Not only that, but again, the biggest challenge I think that a lot of revenue leaders have is actually turnover of staff. I'm not having a particularly great time as an individual contributor. Do you know what? I'm not thinking macroeconomically about things. The grass is greener somewhere else. I will go and take another role somewhere else. Where does that leave the frontline manager? With a hole in the team. Because the person's just left. Still got the quota to carry, but now I have a problem. I then have to re-recruit, which costs time, effort and money. I then bring somebody on board. I've then got to ramp them. So that's another 6 months to get them, remember, to be effective, not efficient. And then where am I? I've probably missed my year at that point as soon as somebody goes. So it's really, really important that all the things that we're talking about have this really positive effect on retention as much as anything else. Because you know what, if I feel valued, I feel like I'm getting great coaching from my line manager, and actually that person is vested in my success, I'm much more likely to stick around.
Because you can take a long-term vision as an individual.
Totally. And I think it just becomes, an upward spiral, or virtuous circle, however you want to describe it, that actually, your team buys into, and they buy into you as a line manager because of it. They can see your intent, and that's why I think intent is so much more important. And it's interesting, I think this is a story I've related to you before. Many years ago, when I was a jobbing AE, I had a line manager, great character, a guy by the name of Raphael Roa, and he was then our VP for sales for EMEA. And I remember sitting down with him, and in a very paternalistic way, he was sitting there wagging his finger at me saying, "Louis, the more you focus on your number, the less likely you are to hit it. The more you focus on your customers' numbers, you'll be golden every time." And that stuck with me for decades, because he was absolutely right. When you're talking to customers, when you're talking to your team, and you've got to think of them, in that sort of whole servant manager leader way, they are your customers. The intent is very clear based on what you say, how you act, and how you behave. And that shines through, and people buy into you as an individual. And the whole point of leadership, I believe, is to create followership, which means people have got to trust you. They've got to believe you have their interests at heart, and they've got to see that's how you behave, because that's where the proof is in the pudding. So I think it all works in a very positive way.
Louis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.